Los Angeles never slept. The city buzzed with an intoxicating mix of flashing lights, roaring engines, and distant laughter spilling from rooftop lounges. It was a world of excess, where the rich indulged in fine dining behind velvet ropes while the unseen souls of the streets faded into the shadows, ignored and forgotten. Leonardo DiCaprio stepped out of Le Jardin, an exclusive restaurant nestled in Beverly Hills, where the elite dined on meals that cost more than some made in a month. He had just wrapped up a dinner meeting with industry executives, discussing upcoming film projects, philanthropy ventures, and, of course, the inevitable gossip about Hollywood's latest scandals. His face, illuminated by the neon reflections on the wet pavement, held that familiar blend of quiet intensity and distraction. He was used to the limelight, but he never felt entirely comfortable in it. As he adjusted his blazer and prepared to step into the waiting black SUV, someone made him pause. There, just a few feet from the restaurant entrance, sat a girl. She couldn't have been older than 12 or 13. Wrapped in an oversized hoodie, her thin arms clutched a small, crumpled sign against her chest. The letters were hastily written but painfully clear. "I need help. Please." DiCaprio had seen many homeless people in LA. It was an unavoidable truth of the city. But there was something about this girl that rooted him to the spot. Her eyes, hollow yet alert, darted anxiously to each passerby, as if scanning for danger. She wasn't just another person down on their luck. She was afraid. People walked past her without so much as a second glance. A sharply dressed couple exiting the restaurant deliberately turned their heads away, whispering to each other. A man in a tailored suit scoffed and muttered something under his breath about panhandlers before climbing into his sleek Aston Martin. DiCaprio exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air. Without thinking, he turned toward her. The girl stiffened, clutching her sign tighter. He crouched down to her level, his voice soft but firm. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the cardboard, knuckles pale. Then, hesitantly, she spoke. I just need help." There was something raw in her voice, something that made his stomach twist. "What do you need the money for?" The girl hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the pavement, and for a long, suffocating moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she whispered, "It's not for me." A cold gust of wind swept through the street, but the chill that ran down DiCaprio's spine had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right. DiCaprio watched the girl carefully, noticing how her shoulders tensed as she avoided his gaze. There was something guarded about her, something that went beyond the usual wariness of a homeless person being approached by a stranger. It wasn't just distrust, it was hesitation, like she was weighing whether she should say anything at all. He had seen that look before, in people who carried a secret too heavy for them to hold alone. His instinct told him this wasn't just another case of a runaway or a kid on the streets begging for loose change. Something was wrong. He stayed crouched, keeping his voice level. "What do you mean it's not for you?" The girl shifted slightly, glancing around as if checking if anyone else was listening. Her fingers gripped the sign so tightly that the edges started to fold in her hands. For a moment, she seemed like she might speak, but then she just shook her head and looked down at the sidewalk. DiCaprio didn't push. He had learned a long time ago that forcing people to talk never worked. If she was going to tell him anything, she had to decide to do it on her own. But he also wasn't going to walk away. Not when his gut told him there was more to this than what it seemed. He glanced toward the restaurant. The valet was still standing by his car, waiting. The SUV's engine was running, the driver inside, expecting him to leave. But he wasn't going anywhere. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. The girl hesitated, then barely nodded. "A little," she mumbled, but the way her eyes flickered told him it was a lie. "Come with me," he said, standing up. "Let's get some food." She didn't move at first. Her fingers flexed against the sign, like she was gripping it for security. Then, finally, she exhaled a shaky breath and stood up, grabbing a small backpack beside her. She looked at him with uncertainty, as if still unsure whether she should trust him. "I know a good place," he added. "It's not far." She nodded once. Quiet. Guarded. But she followed him. They walked in silence, past crowds of well-dressed couples laughing as they stepped into high-end cars, past tourists snapping photos under the glow of streetlights. The girl kept close but slightly behind him, as if she was afraid to let her guard down completely. He noticed the way she subtly checked over her shoulder every few minutes, her body tense, like she expected someone to be watching her. He didn't comment on it, but he made a mental note. A few blocks away, he led her into a small diner, one of those places that had been around for decades, where the booths had cracked leather seats and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. The late-night crowd was small, an older couple in the corner, a few night shift workers eating alone. It was quiet, warm, safe. They sat in a booth near the back. A waitress, middle-aged with tired eyes but a kind smile, came over with menus. "What can I get you?" she asked. DiCaprio looked at the girl. "Get whatever you want." She hesitated, glancing at the menu like she wasn't used to having a choice. "Finally," she muttered, "just a burger. And fries." The waitress nodded and looked at him. "And for you?" "Same," he said. As soon as the waitress left, he turned his attention back to the girl. "What's your name?" For the first time since they sat down, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were sharp, studying him, as if trying to figure out how much she should reveal. After a long pause, she finally answered. "Mia." He nodded. "Nice to meet you, Mia." She didn't say anything. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, her body still tense, like she was ready to run if she needed to. He decided to keep the conversation easy, give her space to open up on her own. "How long have you been out here?" Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "A while." "Where are you staying?" She hesitated again, looking at the table instead of at him. "Different places." He could tell she was being deliberately vague, and he understood why. Kids on the streets learn quickly not to give away too much. He wasn't going to push, but he also wasn't going to pretend not to notice the way her hands clenched against the table every time he asked something personal. The food arrived, and for a few minutes, neither of them spoke. She ate quickly, not quite shoveling it down, but with the kind of urgency that told him she wasn't sure when her next meal would come. He let her eat in silence, only speaking again once she had slowed down. "You said the money wasn't for you." His voice was calm, careful. "Who is it for?" Mia tensed again. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set down her burger and wiped her hands on a napkin, staring at the table like she was debating something in her head. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "My brother." DiCaprio didn't react right away. He just let the words sit there, let her take her time. "He's sick," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know what to do." There it was. The real reason. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, something twisted in his chest. This wasn't just about food or shelter. This was about survival. "How old is he?" he asked. 5. "And where is he now?" Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She shook her head. "I can't tell you." "Not wouldn't." "Couldn't." There was a difference. DiCaprio leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Mia, I want to help, but I need to understand what's going on." She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw the real fear in her eyes. Not the general fear of being on the streets, but something deeper, something she was running from. "I can't go back," she whispered. "If they find me, they'll take him away." A cold sense of realization settled over him. This wasn't just a case of homelessness. This was something bigger, something worse. And for the first time, he realized Mia wasn't just a girl trying to survive. She was hiding from something, or someone. DiCaprio didn't react immediately, but his mind was already racing. The way Mia said those words, the way her voice dropped to almost a whisper, the way she glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment, it wasn't the kind of fear that came from simply being homeless. It was deeper, more urgent, the kind that only existed when someone knew they were in real danger. He had seen that look before in people who had run from something, people who had nowhere left to go. She wasn't just afraid of being ignored or abandoned. She was afraid of being found. That changed everything. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that no one else in the diner could hear. "Mia, I need you to be honest with me. Who are you running from?" Her fingers tensed around the napkin in her lap, twisting it until the edges started to tear. She didn't answer right away, her eyes flickering toward the window, scanning the street outside. She took a slow breath, then let it out shakily. "I shouldn't have said anything," she muttered, shaking her head. "I don't know you. I don't know if I can trust you." DiCaprio stayed calm, his expression steady. "You're right. You don't know me. But I'm sitting here, listening. I'm not walking away." Mia hesitated, her fingers still gripping the napkin like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked at him again, searching his face for something. Maybe for a reason to believe him. Maybe for any sign that he was like the people she had learned to fear. He didn't break eye contact. He wasn't going to rush her, wasn't going to demand answers. She had to make the choice. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "My uncle." The words came out flat, but there was something underneath them, something raw. "He's not a good person. He wasn't supposed to have us." When my parents died, we were supposed to go to someone else. But he took us first. Nobody checked. Nobody cared. He told them he was family, that he'd take care of us, and they believed him. DiCaprio felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard stories like this before, children slipping through the cracks, placed with people who were supposed to protect them, only to end up in worse situations than before. The system was broken in ways most people didn't see, and kids like Mia were the ones who suffered for it. He kept his voice steady. What happened? Mia's jaw clenched. He didn't care about us. He just wanted the money. The checks they send every month for taking care of us. That's all we were to him. A paycheck. Her hands curled into fists. It wasn't bad at first. He ignored us most of the time. But then, he started drinking more. And then it got worse. If I did something wrong, he'd yell. Then yelling turned into, she stopped, shaking her head again, like she couldn't bring herself to say the rest out loud. She didn't need to. DiCaprio already knew where this story was going. She took another breath, steadying herself. I could take it. I didn't care what happened to me. But then he started getting angry at my brother. He's just a kid. He doesn't understand. He cries when he's scared. And my uncle, he doesn't like that. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through. One night, I heard him yelling. I went into the room, and my brother was in the corner, crying. My uncle was standing over him, drunk, shouting about how he was sick of babysitting, how he should have never taken us in the first place. He grabbed him. Her hands were shaking now. I knew if I didn't do something, he was going to hurt him. So I took my brother, and we ran. DiCaprio let out a slow breath, absorbing every word. She wasn't just a homeless girl. She wasn't just a runaway. She was trying to keep her brother alive. Mia looked away, her shoulders tense. I thought I could take care of him. I thought I could find a way to keep us safe. But it's harder than I thought. The shelters won't take us in together because I'm not an adult, and I won't let them separate us. So I've been keeping him in a place where my uncle won't find him. It's not great, but it's safe. I go out. I try to get food. I try to find money for medicine when he needs it. Her voice dropped. But he's getting worse. He has asthma. He used to have an inhaler, but it ran out, and I can't afford another one. He's been coughing all night. I don't know what to do anymore. DiCaprio felt a deep, unsettled anger building in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Anger wouldn't help Mia. What she needed right now wasn't outrage, it was solutions. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Where is he now? She flinched slightly at the question, but she didn't shut down. She was considering whether she could tell him, whether she should. He didn't rush her. After another long pause, she finally spoke. An abandoned building. It's not far. I made a space for him where nobody would find him. DiCaprio nodded. Take me to him. Mia hesitated again. Why? Why do you even care? He met her gaze without hesitation. Because no one else did. She studied him for a long time, her lips pressed together, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay. She slid out of the booth, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. DiCaprio stood up, leaving cash on the table. The waitress gave them a curious glance but didn't say anything. They walked out together into the night, past the glowing streetlights and the distant hum of the city. Mia led the way, her steps quick and cautious. DiCaprio followed without question. Somewhere out there, a 5-year-old boy was waiting for his sister to come back. And he wasn't going to let her do this alone. Mia moved quickly, keeping her head down, leading DiCaprio through narrow streets and alleys, avoiding well-lit areas where people might take notice. She walked with the kind of urgency that came from experience, from knowing that every second wasted could mean something going wrong. DiCaprio stayed close behind, scanning the surroundings, noting how she constantly glanced over her shoulder. She wasn't just nervous, she was expecting someone to be following. That only made him more certain that whatever she was running from hadn't been left in the past. They passed through a quieter neighborhood, the kind that had been forgotten by the rest of the city, where the streetlights flickered and boarded-up windows lined the sidewalks. Mia finally slowed down, approaching a building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The entrance was covered with plywood, but she moved to the side, toward a section of broken fencing, slipping through with practiced ease. DiCaprio followed, stepping carefully over loose debris as they entered the darkened interior. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of dust and neglect. The floor was littered with remnants of whatever the building had once been, discarded furniture, broken glass, empty cans. Mia didn't stop. She led him through a narrow hallway, past rooms filled with forgotten remnants of people who had likely passed through before. Then, finally, she reached a door at the end. She knocked lightly before opening it. Inside, curled up on a thin mattress in the corner of the room, was a boy. He was small, even for his age, wrapped in an oversized hoodie that barely covered his frail frame. His breathing was uneven, shallow, and as Mia stepped inside, he stirred, coughing weakly. She immediately moved to his side, kneeling beside him, brushing his hair back. "Ethan," she whispered. "I'm here." His eyes fluttered open, barely focused. "Mia," he murmured, his voice hoarse. DiCaprio stepped inside, taking in the small, makeshift space. There were a few blankets, a couple of plastic water bottles, and a worn-out backpack in the corner. Nothing else. No real warmth, no security, nothing a child should have to live with. He moved closer, crouching down a few feet away. The boy barely reacted, his breathing labored, his face pale. "How long has he been like this?" DiCaprio asked, his voice steady. Mia looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes, but she answered. "It started a few days ago. At first, it was just a cough. But it's getting worse. I tried to keep him warm. I tried to find medicine, but she stopped, frustration clear in her expression. DiCaprio didn't hesitate. "We're taking him to a hospital." Mia stiffened. "No." He met her gaze. "Mia, he needs real help. He can't stay here like this." She shook her head, gripping Ethan's hand. "If we go to a hospital, they'll ask questions. They'll find out we don't have a guardian. They'll take him away from me." Her voice broke slightly, but she held firm. "I can't let that happen." DiCaprio understood the fear. He had seen what happened in situations like this. Kids placed in the system, separated, sent to places that weren't always better than what they had run from. But he also knew there was no choice. Ethan was too weak. If they stayed here, waiting for things to improve, there might not be another chance. He took a breath, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I get it. I do. But right now, the only thing that matters is making sure Ethan gets the help he needs. You want to keep him safe? Then let's do what's best for him." Mia didn't answer immediately. She looked at Ethan, at the way his breathing hitched with every inhale. She was fighting against her own instincts, against the fear that trusting someone else would only lead to more loss. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "If we go, and they try to take him from me." DiCaprio cut her off. "I won't let that happen." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. He didn't say it as a suggestion. He said it as a fact. Mia swallowed hard, then nodded. DiCaprio moved quickly, pulling out his phone, making a call to one of the few people he trusted to handle situations like this discreetly. He didn't want to draw unnecessary attention. The less involvement from authorities, the better for now. Within minutes, a car arrived outside the building. Mia carried Ethan, his body light in her arms, and DiCaprio stayed close as they made their way outside. The driver didn't ask questions. He knew better than to. They got in. The city blurred past them as they drove through the night, toward the only place that mattered now, the hospital. The car moved through the empty streets, headlights cutting through the darkness as they sped toward the hospital. Mia sat in the back seat, holding Ethan close to her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around him, as if she could shield him from everything that had already happened. He barely reacted, his head resting against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and uneven. Every few seconds, she whispered his name, as if afraid that if she stopped, he might slip away entirely. DiCaprio sat beside her, watching, his mind already working through the possibilities. He didn't know what condition Ethan was in exactly, but he could tell it was bad. Worse than Mia had admitted. It had been a mistake to wait this long, and she knew it too. The driver pulled up to a private medical center, one that DiCaprio had called ahead to ensure discretion. He didn't want questions, didn't want social workers immediately stepping in before Ethan even had a chance to get help. He needed time to figure out the next move, and right now, the priority was making sure the boy made it through the night. Mia hesitated when the car stopped. Her grip on Ethan tightened, and she didn't move to get out. Her breathing was uneven now too, and when DiCaprio looked at her, he saw something in her expression that he hadn't before: panic. Not the fear she had shown before, not the wariness of trusting him, but something worse. The realization that this was no longer in her control. She had spent so long being the one to take care of Ethan, to keep him safe, that the idea of handing him over to anyone else, even if it was for medical help, was something she couldn't process. "Mia." DiCaprio's voice was calm, steady. "We're doing this for him." She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Ethan's face, as if memorizing every detail before something could take him away from her. "What if they don't let me stay with him?" she whispered. DiCaprio didn't answer right away. He knew there was a possibility that the hospital would bring in the authorities, that once Ethan was checked in, things could spiral beyond what Mia could control. But he had already decided he wasn't going to let that happen. He had enough influence to keep things contained, at least for now. "You're not leaving him," he said firmly. "You're walking in with him, and you're staying with him. I'll handle the rest." She finally looked at him then, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. When she didn't find any, she gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but it was enough. DiCaprio stepped out first, nodding to the driver to stay close, just in case they needed to leave quickly. Mia followed, carefully shifting Ethan in her arms as she stepped out of the car. He was barely responsive, his small body limp against her. She swallowed hard, adjusting her hold on him before walking toward the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, the quiet hum of machines and distant murmurs of medical staff filling the space. A nurse at the front desk looked up, her expression shifting immediately when she saw Ethan. She stood, already assessing the situation before a word was spoken. "What happened?" she asked, moving around the desk. "He's been sick for days," DiCaprio answered before Mia could. "His breathing is getting worse." The nurse nodded sharply, signaling to a nearby doctor. Within seconds, 2 more nurses arrived with a stretcher, moving quickly but carefully. Mia flinched when they reached for Ethan, her body instinctively pulling back. But DiCaprio placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "They're helping him." She let go, her arms trembling slightly as Ethan was lifted onto the stretcher and rushed down the hall. Mia immediately moved to follow, but one of the nurses stopped her. "Wait here," the woman said. "We need to stabilize him first." Mia's expression shifted instantly, her body going rigid. "No, I need to be with him." DiCaprio stepped in before things could escalate. "She stays." His voice was final, leaving no room for argument. "He's been alone enough." The nurse hesitated, her professional demeanor wavering under the weight of his words. After a brief pause, she gave a small nod. "One of you can go in." DiCaprio turned to Mia. "Go." She didn't wait. She moved past the nurse, following the stretcher as fast as her legs would allow. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving DiCaprio standing in the middle of the hallway. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had gotten them this far, but it wasn't over. If Ethan's condition was serious, he would need more than just a night in a hospital bed. And even if he recovered, the problem of where they would go next still remained. Mia had no legal guardianship over Ethan, and once the system got involved, she would have no say in what happened to him. He couldn't let that happen. Pulling out his phone, he stepped outside and made another call. The line rang twice before a voice picked up. "I need a favor," DiCaprio said without preamble. "It's urgent." There was a pause on the other end, then a simple response. "Tell me what you need." DiCaprio glanced back toward the hospital doors, his jaw tightening. "I need to make sure a little boy doesn't disappear into the system." The minutes stretched into hours. DiCaprio remained in the hospital hallway, leaning against the cold wall, arms crossed as he watched doctors and nurses move in and out of rooms, their footsteps echoing against the sterile floor. His contact had promised to make some calls, to pull strings where necessary, but none of that mattered if Ethan didn't make it through the night. He glanced toward the closed doors leading to the emergency ward. He had expected Mia to come back out, to demand answers, to ask if he was doing something to help. But she hadn't left Ethan's side, and that told him everything he needed to know. She had been running, surviving, making decisions no child should have to make, but at the core of it all, Ethan was her world. She wasn't going to leave him, no matter what happened next. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He pulled it out, checking the screen before answering. "The boy is in the system," the voice on the other end said without hesitation. Mia wasn't lying about that. No official reports of abuse, but there have been complaints. Neighbors called it in a few times, said they heard shouting, saw things that didn't sit right, but nothing ever came of it. DiCaprio's jaw tightened. That wasn't surprising. Too many cases slipped through the cracks, especially when no one with real power was paying attention. The uncle. A mess. Record isn't clean, but nothing solid enough to get him removed as a guardian. He gets the checks, keeps his head down, and the system doesn't look twice. DiCaprio exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. What happens if they get involved now? If the hospital reports Ethan's condition and the truth about their situation comes out, Child Services steps in. They'll take him, separate them, and Mia will be sent to a group home. A pause. You know what that means. DiCaprio did. Foster care wasn't always a safety net. It was a system overloaded with cases, understaffed, filled with kids who slipped through the cracks just like Mia had. She wouldn't get placed with Ethan. She'd lose him. And the uncle? He'd probably be given another chance before anyone actually investigated. DiCaprio ran a hand over his face. I need an alternative. Only way to keep them together is legal guardianship. But that's not happening in a night. Even with your name, it's a process. DiCaprio's mind was already moving ahead. Then we buy time. You're serious about this? He glanced back at the doors, then down the hallway where a nurse was filling out paperwork. They need someone to fight for them. No one else is going to. There was a short silence on the other end, then a sigh. All right, I'll see what I can do. Just don't get yourself too deep into something you can't fix. DiCaprio ended the call without answering. He had already decided there was no walking away from this. The doors pushed open, and Mia stepped out. Her eyes were red, exhaustion clear on her face, but there was something else too, relief. She walked toward him, hands gripping the sleeves of her hoodie as if she didn't know what to do with him. They said he's going to be okay, she said quietly. He has to stay here for a few days, but they think he'll recover. She hesitated, then swallowed hard. They haven't asked me anything yet. About where we've been. But they will. DiCaprio nodded. They'll want answers. And if we don't give them the right ones, they'll separate you. Mia's fingers curled into fists. I can't let them take him. I'd rather, she stopped herself, shaking her head. I won't let them take him. You won't have to. DiCaprio's voice was calm, but there was no uncertainty in it. I made some calls. There's a way to keep you together, but it won't be easy. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer right away. He could have said it was because he had the resources, because he had seen too many kids like her slip through the cracks, because he knew what it was like to feel powerless. But none of those were the real reason. Because someone should have helped you a long time ago, he finally said. Mia held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, she nodded. Over the next few hours, things moved quickly. DiCaprio made more calls, arranging for temporary guardianship, finding a private doctor who could oversee Ethan's recovery without triggering immediate intervention from child services. Mia stayed by her brother's side, refusing to leave even when the nurses suggested she rest. By the time morning came, there was a plan in place. It wasn't perfect, and there were still risks, but it was better than letting the system take control. When Mia finally stepped out of Ethan's hospital room again, she looked at DiCaprio with an expression he hadn't seen before, hope. What happens now? She asked. DiCaprio gave a small nod toward the hallway. Now we make sure no one takes him from you. Mia didn't say anything, but the way her shoulders straightened told him everything he needed to know. She was ready to fight, and she wasn't alone anymore.